Hi, I'm Marla from OrsinisAngels, and if you saw my last video, I showed you how I used a vintage photo that's in the public domain that I found on Wikipedia of a child photographed to be an angel as an inspiration for a drawing that I did of an angel. And I did this in graphite, and if you want to see the step-by-step process that I used to draw this, you can, I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how I add color to this piece with watercolors. And if you hadn't seen the video before, what I'm using here is a hot press, which is a very fine watercolor paper, and this particular one is by Fabriano. And since I'm using water, I did tape it down using artist masking tape to a board so that when I add the water, it will naturally buckle up. So this will help it flatten out during the drying process. And the watercolors that I'm using, I like to make these little kits, and I take them when I go painting out and about. I like to do plein air painting, and I do have a video on how I created this little watercolor paint box. And what I always do when I use my watercolors is I will put a test sample so I see what they look like and label them in all of my paint boxes. And I also have one that I put together because I couldn't limit myself to so few when I go out and about painting. So I had another little tin and I added a couple of other colors to it. And I always, like I said, label them so I can see what they look like on paper before I dip my paintbrush into them. And I'm using just wee little jars, kind of recycling them for water. And I always use two because I dip in one for dirty and then dip in one for clean, because otherwise you can really muddy your watercolors up. So I am using a relatively nice brush, and this is a brush that I use when I do go traveling out and about. I take these with me because they fold up. But use what you have. But if two of the things that I feel are really important for watercolors are the quality of your brush and the quality of your paper. So if those are the only things that you can afford for a good quality, then those are the things I would spend money on. And this is actually a Escoda Reserva, and I've really liked them. And they kind of put up with quite a bit. I've had them for quite a while. So if you're using pan watercolors, a good thing to do before you dip your brush into them is to wet them. And I usually keep water in a little spray bottle. And I'm not sure what colors I'm going to use today, so I'm just going to spray away just to start out the process. Now, when I'm painting on hot press, which is the smoother paper, I try not to go crazy with the water. The cold press is much more forgiving when you're using a lot of water versus the hot press, but I am going to do that today. And I'm using a little flower porcelain palette for my, if I want to take the colors and not have them so intense to start out with. And I think the first color I'm going to start with is, let me see, I think I'm going to use a brown oxide. And this is, the one that I have is Daniel Smith. But, you know, use what you have and the colors you have. But I think I'm going to do that and then just add a little bit of water to it and my brush. And I always keep a little paper towel to pick up things that I accidentally don't want if it's too intense, you know, because you can add too much color. I like to do layers instead of just doing it all at once. And by doing layers, you can actually add more color to it down the road, but you really can't take away. So I do tend to try to go lightly in the beginning when I'm painting. And I'm just kind of going in, you know, since I did the graphite first, I really have quite a bit of shading to begin with, to work with. And so it's not like you were starting with a blank paper. And I kind of like that. I like having the shading first. I mean, I do it both ways. Sometimes I just use directly the watercolors, and other times I use the graphite. And here what I'm doing is I'm kind of making the shadows a little bit more gradual by adding just a little bit of water to the edges. And so it's not a dramatic line between, you know, the shadows and not. And one of the things that I do with watercolors, and a lot of watercolor artists do, is you use your highlights by leaving areas of the painting without paint. So instead of like with acrylics or oils, you kind of go back and you can add white. You really, with watercolors, to get the translucent effect, that is the beauty of using watercolors. You start with light and go darker, and for your highlights you do leave parts of the paper just blank, you know, so that acts as your highlight. So I'm just kind of going in, and again, it's almost like, you know, just adding some of the shadows by the eyes and, you know, around the sides of the face. And here I did put a little bit more, so I just dipped my paintbrush into the water, and then I dabbed it on the towel to take off a little excess of the paint. And I'm going to go into the mouth area. And kind of darken that, you know, line between the lips. And then the upper lip is typically darker than the lower lip. Usually the lower lip, there's more highlights and more light hits it. Okay, and so I'm going to kind of go in to under her neck, or her neck area. And continue to add the shadows. And then kind of soften the edges with a little bit of water on my paintbrush. And I'm going to I think use maybe a light blue for her wings for the shadows, and I think what I'm going to pick is a cerulean blue, and this again is a Daniel Smith color, and I made my own. I bought empty half pans. You can get them on Amazon, or you can get them on Dick Blick. And I filled them with tube watercolors. So I get to pick exactly what colors I want and what brand I want to use. And I have an assortment of different brands. One of the watercolor brands that I started out with was the Winsor Newton. A lot of people like those. And then I kind of started using some Holbein, and I like those too. And then I tried, just because I saw that some other artists was using the Daniel Smith, and I do like those quite a bit. And I've also tried the Sennelier. I'm not sure if I say that right, but it's they are made in France, and the Daniel Smiths are made in the U.S., and the Sennelier are made in France. And I like those, all of them. So, and then I think here, like I kind of, in the picture, it was kind of, they use some tool to kind of get the effect of like a cloud. So I'm going to use a little bit of the cerulean blue and just kind of put it in different places to kind of get that airy effect. And I may go in later again. And then for the hair, I think what I'm going to start out with is maybe I think I have a Quin Gold, so maybe I'll start out with that for some shadow. And I'll put that here. And then I'm kind of just going to leave areas white, or, you know, without paint for some of the highlights. And I'm kind of going in where I did some shading. And if you don't, before you, just to backtrack a little bit, if you have pencil marks that you don't want to show up in the final picture, you really need to erase them before you add the watercolors, because for some reason the watercolors, I think it's more just the water, seals those pencil marks in, and then you're not able to erase them later. So, and I did not use a fixative on this. A lot of graphite artists, they will use a fixative so that you don't smear the graphite, because graphite can be smeared, as you saw in the previous video if you watched it, which is how you get a lot of your shading. And so if you don't want it smeared, you really do need to use a fixative. But here I'm just kind of going along, and this is, you know, the first layer, and I am going to do other layers. And when you're not using a lot of water and blending everything in with each other, if you want to keep layers separate, you kind of let them dry and then go back in. And I'm not using a lot of water in the techniques that I'm using for this painting. And I'm finding that the top is pretty much darker than the bottom, which I didn't really intend, but so I'm going to throw in a little bit more paint while it's still wet to increase the intensity a little bit. You may have different ways of doing this and different techniques that you use, and that's okay. I'm just sharing today with you what I do and my process. That doesn't mean it's the only process. Obviously, there's so many different ways to use watercolors and mixed media art. So there's always something exciting and new to figure out and try. What I'd like to do is add a little bit of a rosy tone to this, and I think I'm gonna take another little palette. A lot of times what I use, because I like pretty little things, I collect antique butter plates, and I do use them as a palette sometimes. And I think what I'm going to use, the color for the rosiness, is Rhodonite Genuine, and this is a Daniel Smith color. And I'm just kind of cleaning off my brush in the dirty water, dipping in the clean water, and adding a little water to it so it's not so intense. And I'm going to add a little bit to the lips, and I'm finding that I had too much water on my brush, and a little bit to the lower lip. So you can see that the going in with the brown first gives it a little darker to the upper lip, which is what I wanted. And I like to have a little bit of pink on the tip of the nose, and maybe on the flares of the nose. And I'm going to rinse my brush and kind of blend that out a little bit, because I found it was a little too intense. Just to soften it. And I'm going to add a little bit more over here. And again, I just cleaned my brush and dried it off so that I can shade that color in a little bit and blend it. And I'm going to do it on this side too. Give her kind of the rosy cheek look. But again, you know, you see that I'm leaving some spots without color at all to maintain those highlights. And I'm going to do a little bit on the side of her eyes. And then clean off my brush and kind of shade that in. And then just that on the other side. And I'd like to put a little bit on her chin. And then I think I'm going to leave that alone for now. Actually, no, I'm not. I'm going to add a little bit under her eyes. And then, you know, I just kind of shading that in with a cleaner dry brush. And here I got a little bit more than I wanted to, so I just kind of wipe that off with the brush. And I might add a little bit to the top of her lips. And then just a dot in the corner of her eye, and a dot in the corner of this eye. This one got more than I planned, so I'm just going to pick a little bit up. There. And then I'm going to leave that alone for a few minutes. And I think what I'm going to do is go in with a little darker color for the hair. And I think what I'm going to use is a L.Niederer Venetian red. I'm just going to add a little bit to my palette. And since I, you know, dipped my paintbrush into that, I'm putting it in the dirty water, cleaning it off, and putting it in the clean water before I continue. So I'm just going to kind of add a little bit where I want it darker on the hair. Not the loosest type of watercolor painting in the world. It's more of a controlled watercolor painting, and for different things I do like a looser style for different types of painting, but for this I'm using more of a controlled method. So that means less water, less blending on the paper, but I'm doing more layering, so that does blend on the paper, but it's a more controlled, layered kind of mixing. And I think I'm going to add a little bit more blue to the wings. And again, I'm using a cerulean blue. And I'm putting it onto my palette. And cleaning my brush. And then adding a little more darker. And then I'm gonna kind of blend it a little bit with a clean brush with a little water, and go back and do that in a couple other places. I think I'm going to use just a touch of that rhodonite genuine and add a little bit to give a little rosy glow to the cloud area. I think I'm going to go back in with a little bit of burnt sienna. So I'm just going to wet my palette again and get a little bit of burnt sienna on my little flower palette. And I'm going to add it a little bit for shading. So I kind of like that color, and I think I'm going to add some of that to her hair. So what I'm using again is the burnt sienna. I think I'm going to use green for her eyes. And I have Daniel Smith green gold. So I think that's what I'm going to use. I'm just putting a little bit on my palette. And you can see where the highlight of the eye is, so I'm going to leave that without color. And I think I'm going to let her sit for a little bit, let her dry, and come back to her. Sometimes that helps when you get too engrossed in your painting, and sometimes you need to just kind of let it sit for a little bit, although it's really hard to do. But there, I'm going to let it sit for now and come back.